Alright, Trickies and Trickers, time for the final episode of Review of the Day, which is Whispers. The USS Rio Grande enters the wormhole. O'Brien is at the helm and instructs the computer on a new course, the Paratus system at maximum warp. Since the journey is going to take over an hour, he decides to create a log entry, creating a new file for a personal log. After prompting the computer, he begins. O'Brien's personal log, starting 4075A1.2. I got to try to set the record straight about the last 52 hours. I don't know who's going to hear this. I don't even know if I'll be alive by the time this log is recovered. I figure they'll be coming after me, if I'm right about this whole thing. They won't warn me. They won't want me to warn the Paradas. He pauses and, turning to the replicator, asks for his favorite beverage. Coffee, Jamaican blend, double strong, double sweet. He then continues with his log. I wish I could tell you who they are, but that's part of the puzzle I haven't figured out yet. Part of the puzzle. Hell, none of this whole damn thing makes any sense. I'm trying to remember the first time I noticed things were wrong. It seems to me it was, it had to be the first morning after I got back to the station. O'Brien awakens in his quarters and quickly notices that his wife is missing from her side of the bed. Putting on a gown, he heads into the living area where Keiko and Molly are having their breakfast. He asks them what they're doing up at 5:30 in the morning. Keiko says she has a lot of essays to read and so wanted to get an early start, though there was a nervous slant to her voice, as if she doesn't know exactly what to say. O'Brien doesn't pay much attention to it and simply orders a cup of coffee from the replicator before saying good morning to Molly. He asks her if she had sweet dreams last night, but she tells him to go away and rushes off into her room. Keiko explains it's just a phase and not to let it bother him. Though he does seem concerned, the chief sits down and enjoys his coffee anyway, allowing Keiko to clear the table. As she begins to place the plates into the replicator, Keiko wants to know all about O'Brien's time with the Paradas. The chief explains that they had him going through basic training on all their security measures for an upcoming peace conference, saying he believes Odo would enjoy it far more than he did. After clearing away the last of the dishes, Keiko gets ready to leave. O'Brien offers to drop Molly at daycare on his way to work, but Keiko immediately rejects the idea. She says that she is taking Molly to school with her as there is a Vulcan program she wants to show her while her mind is fresh. Picking Molly up, she heads out, leaving a confused O'Brien to drink his coffee. A short while later, in the security office, Ensign Curtis is conducting some repair when the chief walks in. He tells Curtis that he was waiting until Odo returned from Bajor before he conducted any repairs. The Nancy explains he was ordered to do it by Commander Sisko. O'Brien is noticeably annoyed with the idea that Sisko didn't consult him on this and so departs, leaving to Curtis to continue his work. As he walks down the promenade, he sees the commander engaged in serious conversation with Keiko outside the school. As Sisko leaves in the turbolift, O'Brien hides out of sight, wondering what's going on. In the runabout, O'Brien is now 53 minutes away from the Parada system. Directing the sensors back towards the wormhole, he has the computer display information of pursuing craft. It's the USS Mekong. He knows it can't catch up to him at warp, so sits back and orders the computer to continue his log entry. Okay, so I was all a little curious, but who would have guessed at that time? I mean, the way they were acting, they might have been trying to pull off one of those surprise parties that I can't stand. Only my birthday's not until September, and believe me, as it turned out, I had nothing else to celebrate. O'Brien arrives in Ops, where everyone is busy at work as usual. As he heads to his station, Dr. Bashir makes himself known. The chief is overdue a physical, and Bashir wants him to report to the infirmary within the hour. The chief objects, saying it's too much work, but the doctor persists. Just then, Sisko comes out of his office and asks what's going on. Bashir explains the situation, forcing Sisko to order O'Brien to his physical. The chief gives in and tells Bashir he'll be down in an hour. As Bashir walks off, O'Brien asks to see Sisko in his office. As the two enter the room, Sisko apologizes for assigning Ensign to Curtis without advising him. I guess I dropped the ball on that one, Sisko tells O'Brien while holding his baseball. Changing the subject, Sisko asks him about the Paradas and if there's anything the chief can tell him that is off the record. One thing comes to mind. The Paradas have an odor from some kind of skin excretion which changes their moods. but it seems like Cisco was after something different. O'Brien reassures him that all the security protocols will be in place for the arrival of the Paradan delegation, something that he will see to personally. The commander insists that's not necessary and instead asks him to see to the 3 pylons that have gone down again. He explains they had to tow a Boeing freighter into one of the lower pylons just that morning. Bewildered, O'Brien swears he has just been over those systems and they were working perfectly fine, but agrees to look at them right away nonetheless. Cisco reminds him that his physical comes first as the chief gets up and heads for the door. Before he leaves, he tries to ask Cisco about his chat with Keiko on the promenade. He explains that Jake has been having some problems with his grades, to which a relieved O'Brien assures him Keiko will do what she can to help him. In the infirmary, Bashir has finally gotten O'Brien to submit to his physical, though the chief isn't happy about it in the slightest, not hesitating to wind up the doctor with his sarcastic comments. After a few medical questions, Bashir asks him about his parents' health. Annoyed, O'Brien reminds him that his mother died 2 years ago and he told Bashir all of this before, when his father remarried to a woman he has never met. Finally, frustrated by all the questioning, he leaps to his feet and demands to know why the medical is taking so long. Suddenly, he comes to the conclusion that he must be dying and that's why everyone is behaving strangely. Before he could ponder on it any longer, Bashir calmly reports he is in perfect health and is free to go. Having changed back into his uniform, O'Brien is now heading along the promenade when he is greeted by Jake Cisco, who needs his help in building a subspace transceiver for his school science project. Recounting how he used to build them as a young boy himself, the chief says he's more than happy to help him get those grades back up. But Jake doesn't seem to know what he's talking about. "Oh, my grades are great," he says. "I just want to keep them that way." A bewildered O'Brien looks on as Jake walks off, wondering why Cisco would have lied to him. Cisco was telling the truth about one thing. The upper pylons had failed again. It didn't make any sense, because the new pressure locks I'd installed seemed to be working just fine, so it had to be an entirely new problem. I realized it wasn't going to be a quick matter to track it down after all, and I couldn't help thinking how this was going to keep me occupied while the security arrangements for the Paradas were underway. I'm in the station's corridors, and Inspector Curtis is finished working on the security arrangements for the Paradan quarters when Chief O'Brien arrives. He orders Curtis to open up the door so he can check everything over himself, but as Jensen explains, the security field has been activated and only Major Kira can authorize access. Tapping his comm badge, O'Brien asks Kira for the access codes, but Cisco interrupts over the comm, wanting to know what he's doing there when he should be seen to the upper pylons. The chief argues he should be permitted to see the preparations but is overruled. He reluctantly complies with Cisco and seemingly walks back to the upper pylons. However, turning a corner, he stops and watches as Curtis opens the door to the Paradan quarters. It seems he was lying about the access codes. Back on the promenade, O'Brien has a deep thought when he is interrupted again by Jake, who has with him an inverter for his science project. He asks the chief if it's the right one, and after close examination, he replies it is, but he hasn't seen one of these models in a long time. Jake explains he replicated it from a really, really old data file. O'Brien then invites him to come around his quarters later so they could put it together, but we're asking him if anything unusual happened on the station while he was gone. Before Jake can reply, Major Kira interrupts, telling him his father he needs to see him about something important. As he walks away, Kira smiles, asking O'Brien if everything's under control. "All under control, Major," he replies. "I worked in the pylon controls the better part of the day. A needle in a haystack wouldn't do this job justice. When I found out the crack in the RF power conduit, I couldn't imagine how it could have occurred so deep in the system, unless someone had broken it deliberately." A tired O'Brien staggers into his quarters to place himself on the sofa. Keiko informs him that Cisco just called and Jake can't make it tonight due to illness, which he finds peculiar since he was talking to him on the promenade just a few hours ago. He then notices that Molly is missing, but Keiko explains she's spending the night at the Fredericksons. With that in mind, O'Brien tries to start up a bit of romance with his wife by kissing her, but she uncharacteristically backs away, saying she's just too tired for it, and finishes replicating dinner. The chief notices she had replicated fricandeau stew for him, his favorite, but since she doesn't like it, she's going to have the salad instead. O'Brien is suspicious. He plays with the food before going to take a mouthful. Noticing Keiko is looking at him with anticipation in her eyes, he stops, the fork inches from his mouth. Placing it back on his plate, he decides he doesn't have an appetite after all. I don't know if there was anything wrong with the stew or not. When I went back later to check, she already put it into the disposal. All I could think of as I looked at her was that this was not my Keiko. On the Rio Grande, O'Brien instructs the computer to play back the last line of his personal log. You're right, he mutters to himself. She wasn't. I didn't get much sleep that night. I waited for Keiko or whoever she was to go to bed, and I started my search. I had no idea what I was looking for. Something odd, something not quite normal, anything to explain what might be going on. Scan complete, the computer announces. No unknown microorganisms detected. O'Brien continues to go through station sensor records, checking for unknown chemical agents, subharmonic transmissions, unusual neural wave patterns, even telepathic activity. I'll return a negative result. It then asks the computer to display the vessel arrival logs in attempt to locate something unusual, but again, there is nothing. Sighing, he replicates another cup of coffee, then orders the computer to play back the logs of all officers on the station. It takes time for the computer to play through the logs of all the senior officers, but nothing seems out of the ordinary, that is, until the computer comes to a log which cannot be accessed. It seems all logs from the time O'Brien returned to the station are restricted to level 1 access only and would accept his access code. Arriving ops, the chief heads for the operations pit, but before he can do much, he's interrupted by Ensign de Curtis, who offers his help with any repairs he may be making. O'Brien politely declines his help, explaining that he is trying to get the upper pylons ready by morning, which de Curtis seems to accept. There were several traps laid into the computer's subroutine, no doubt to let someone know if I'd penetrated their security logout. I wasn't fooled for a minute and released the protective files without any problem. O'Brien makes his way back to his quarters, making certain that nobody is following him. What I found on those hidden logs didn't answer all my questions, but sure as hell confirmed what I'd been afraid of. They were analyzing and reanalyzing everything I put into my report about Perrodin's security. They'd even broke into my personal logs to see what they could find in there. I hope they enjoyed reading the sexy letters to my wife. There were several entries by Cisco about secured messages from the Perrodin system, but no indication what those messages were about. Maybe they were afraid I'd get into their files, even with the security lockout. Smart people. At one of the station's airlocks, a Bajoran transport has just docked. Several passengers begin to disembark, with Odo among them. O'Brien takes the security chief to one side and explains his suspicions about the crew. Odo tells him to do nothing while he investigates, and once they have some solid proof, they can go to Starfleet and the Bajoran authorities. I felt better than I had for a long time. I finally had an ally. Now all I had to do was wait. I like to think I'm a man with many talents, but waiting's one of them. I had to cover my bets, prepare myself for whatever might happen next. I still had a few tricks up my sleeve. In his quarters, O'Brien opens his toolkit and takes out several small pieces. After assembling them all together, he places the device behind his uniform sleeve, just in case. Having left his quarters, O'Brien is now sitting on the upper level of Quark's, watching everyone walk by and waiting for something to happen. Quark then interrupts his thoughts. The odds are against you, O'Brien, he taunts. The chief, thinking he knows something, grabs the Ferengi by his collar and demands to know what he means by it. It turns out Quark was simply referring to the racquetball match scheduled with Bashir for next week. Hearing this, the chief realizes he has made a mistake and lets him go. Quark then asks for information on the Perrodins, explaining, "It's always good business to know about new customers before they walk in your door." The chief tells him to find his information elsewhere before he's summoned to the security office by Odo. In his office, Odo asks O'Brien what he knows about the Perrodin rebels. It looks as if the secret communication messages he found were in fact to the rebels, a direct breach of the agreement they had with the Perrodin government. O'Brien immediately suggests they cancel the talks, but Odo disagrees, prompting the chief to suspect him as well. Before he can do anything, Cisco and Kira, both armed with phasers, enter an attempt to take him into custody, but O'Brien has other plans. Taking the device from his sleeve, he throws it to the floor, where it explodes with a tense flash, stunning everyone in the room. Grabbing Kira's weapon, he stunts the two security guards on the promenade and escapes through one of the adjoining corridors. In the corridor, O'Brien orders the computer to lock into his combat and initiate an emergency transport to the Rio Grande, but the computer denies his request. Throwing his combat to the floor, he continues to run down the corridor, but is soon stopped by force fields. Realizing he can't take them down, he does the exact opposite and raises all the force fields on the station, prompting Cisco's team to disable them all. Stone's way to a runabout, O'Brien bumps into Jake. He tries to explain what's happening, but Jake has seemingly been affected as well and calls for security to that location before running away. No one can go back or forward. O'Brien crawls into one of the access conduits just as Odo's security teams arrive. O'Brien manages to make it to a ladder in the crawl space and begins to climb higher and higher. The climb wears him out and he soon drops his phaser down the tube. He eventually makes it to his destination, the cargo bay, where he uses the cargo transporter to beam himself to a runabout. After disengaging the docking clamps, Cisco appears at the comm channel and orders him to stand down, but O'Brien has no intention of doing so. With the tractor being sabotaged, Cisco opens fire on the runabout, reducing his shield strength significantly. With the quicker routing of the emergency life support power, the shield strength quickly increases and O'Brien escapes the range of Deep Space Nine. He meets up with Subspace Channel Admiral Rollman at Starbase 401 to inform her of the situation, but she doesn't seem to accept what he's saying and orders him back to the station. O'Brien terminates the communication upon hearing the order. It seemed almost unbelievable to me. Had someone or something started to infiltrate all of Starfleet? Laying in a new course, O'Brien takes the ship through the wormhole, on heading for the Parada system. With just 1 minute until the Parada system, O'Brien replicates himself another cup of coffee as he formulates his plan to escape the Mekong. Along with Parada 4 being the largest planet in the system, he decides to head there and so adjusts course. A few seconds later, the runabout enters range. O'Brien instructs the computer to reduce speed to allow the Mekong to catch up, but after a few seconds it gauges full impulse and swings into orbit of a nearby moon, shutting down all power systems on the ship to avoid detection. The pursuing Mekong soon gives up and heads off for a new course for Parada 2, where its crew beam down to the surface. O'Brien, armed with a phaser, follows suit. The chief materializes in some underground caves. Scanning the local area, he notices a doorway of artificial origin. He opens it to find Cisco and Kira meeting with 2 Paradan rebels. Cisco tries to negotiate with him, saying it's not as it seems, but O'Brien isn't listening. One of the rebels, Kotu, tells him that all the answers he needs are behind another door and all he has to do is open it. But he isn't buying it. Kira says they are not the enemy, but before they can negotiate further, another Paradan shoots a bolt of energy at O'Brien, knocking him to the ground. Kotu opens the doorway he pointed before and Bashir rushes out with medical kit in hand. Inside, another Miles O'Brien is lying on a bed, looking surprised. Bashir tries his best to treat the O'Brien on the floor while the other O'Brien approaches him, amazed at the accuracy of the copy. As Cisco and Kotu explain, the real O'Brien had been kidnapped and replaced with a replicant who had been programmed to disrupt the peace talks. Bashir goes on to say how the copy was indistinguishable from the real thing. He recounts the copy had passed to physical flying colors and certainly knew his way around the station. Kotu wonders why the replicant was returning to the planet, and O'Brien suggests that if he knew something was wrong with the station, he'd try and warn someone. Cisco notes that, in a strange way, the replicant was trying to save the day and be a hero. With the replicant version dying rapidly, it holds out an arm to the real O'Brien and says just one thing. Keiko, tell her I love. Aw, that's sad. So anyway, let's take a look at some background information for this episode, beginning with story and script. Writer Paul Robert Coyle's original idea for this episode involved O'Brien waking up one morning to find Molly and Keiko gone, and nobody in the station remembers him ever being there. He then finds out that there is a Chief Miles O'Brien, but he is serving on the Enterprise D, and the episode entails him trying to sort out the mystery. A similar premise will later be used in the Voyager episode Non Sequitur. The general theme of the story appealed to James Crocker and Michael Piller, who gave the job of writing the teleplay to Coyle. However, as the story developed, the writing staff felt the amnesia plot wasn't working. As Coyle explains, quote, "When we got to break sessions, the staff decided that they didn't like any of the amnesia business, so everybody in the room brainstormed and somebody came up with the idea of doing the parallax view, a Warren Beatty-starred suspense thriller from the 1970s, which is highlighted by strong accents of political paranoia as the central character attempts to unravel a dangerous mystery. The parallax view was the only inspiration for this episode, as Iris Even Bear recalls. Quote, in a way, it's invasion of the body snatchers from the body snatchers' point of view. That's what ultimately makes this show tragic and interesting, that the body snatcher doesn't know it. It's fortunate that the show ends so abruptly. I wish we had a little more time there. Excuse me. The decision to use the word replicant when referring to the fake O'Brien was motivated by the desire to use something other than android, which was deemed too familiar with the character of Data, or the term clone, which didn't seem to fit in this instance. Writer Paul Robert Coyle ultimately chose replicant as an homage to the 1982 release film Blade Runner, and the fact the term hadn't already been used in Star Trek. Coyle commented, quote, obviously, this guy wasn't a clone or an android or robot, so what's left? I used replicant and nobody objected. And it's a good thing they weren't also faced with a lawsuit for that, so yeah. So anyway, now let's take a look at the production of this episode. The Starship Arrival roster was created by the art department and features numerous Starship names and assignment information. There were some problems during the production of the episode, as Coyle recounts, quote, the episode came up short for one particular reason. We had to stick entirely on O'Brien for every minute. We couldn't cut away to any of the other characters because they would be saying, we don't think O'Brien is O'Brien. So we could never open the story up for the audience and go to a B story or even linger on two characters after O'Brien leaves the room, because it'd be giving the story away. The flashback structure was added by the in-house staff after Coyle had submitted his draft as a way to expand the story. A scene was filmed with O'Brien singing The Minstrel Boy while being chased on the runabout, an allusion to the TNG episode The Wounded, where it says it is his happy thought song for bad situations. However, due to continuity slip that wasn't noticed till the last minute, the scene was removed. The mistake involved the same name of the pursuing runabout, which is referred to as the Rio Grande. However, the Rio Grande was run around being chased, while the pursuing ship was actually the Mekong. This wasn't noticed until writer Paul Robert Coyle sent a copy of the shooting script, which he only sent out after an episode was completed, and immediately confirmed by Bear. By the time the mistake was spotted, it was too late to sort it out, so the scene was simply removed. Coyle was disappointed it had to be removed, quote, I drove that trouble to add scenes to pad the show out. Here was a 2-page scene they ultimately had cut. The scene can still be read in the episode script. And now finally, let's take a look at some continuity surrounding this episode. This episode marks the second of 2 appearances of Susan Bay as Admiral Rollman. The first was in past prologue. The runabout USS Mekong is introduced as a replacement for the USS Ganges, which was destroyed in the previous episode, Armageddon Game. The Cardassian/Federation Demilitarized Zone is mentioned for the very first time in this episode, a region which will play a significant role in future DS9 and Star Trek The Next Generation episodes, as well as in the series premiere of Star Trek Voyager. Kirk refers to Bashir and O'Brien's racquetball match in Rivals. Jadzia Dax only speaks off-screen in this episode, in O'Brien's playback of vocal station logs. She appears briefly as Bashir amuses O'Brien in Ops. Reference Rules of Acquisition, tentatively number 194. It's always good to know about new customers before they walk in your door. One of the Packlets can be seen on the promenade, sitting next to Jake Sisko. This episode establishes O'Brien's birthday as being in September. This is the first instance of a supposed member of Starfleet being seen using a Bajoran phaser. The O'Brien replicant steals Major Kara's phaser after incapacitating the officers in the security office with a flash grenade. Curiously, Deep Space Nine is seen firing on the Rio Grande with green phaser beams. By the way of the Warrior, DS9 is seen firing standard Starfleet phasers. That is kind of odd, isn't it? So overall, I think it's a pretty darn good episode, and it's definitely, in my opinion, one of the best episodes, not only of the season, but of the show overall. So, yeah. So overall, I give the episode Whispers 5 warp cores out of 5. Well, anyway, tune in tomorrow as we take a look at the next episode, Paradise. So, until then, live long and prosper, everybody.